Is very important, not just about our history, but I think you need to know about the past, not only about ourselves, but people, how people, countries, civilizations come up, go down, what happened. Read about the demagogues, read about fantastic leaders. Sometimes leaders are only fantastic during that time, like Hitler, Churchill, for instance. He was good. He was a war prime minister. He was good. But after that, they didn't want him anymore. Attlee became the prime minister, right? So you have the right prime minister at the right time, because the society then said, okay, you're good then, but you're not good anymore, we don't want you anymore. You understand? So history is very important. Buy this book, A History of Knowledge, tulis, written by Charles Van Doren. You see, it's a book about the past, present, future. It covers all aspects of knowledge, scientific, intellectual, and historical, from the beginning of human experiences until into the 21st century. Okay? There's another book, I can't remember what I'm reading now. It's a Globalization. It's a bit, I think he needs to update this book. It's called Globalization. Because you see, you need to know about everything else around you. To be a good follower or to be a good leader, you must know everything. And now the world is becoming so small, right? And they have all sorts of treaties on trade and everything. So read this book about globalization, then you can understand why sometimes, leaders want to have free trade and then people don't want to have it. There are protests, there are riots all over the place, and now you have to think, why are they doing this? What's happening to our country? Do we open up our market, or do we become a closed market, or what? So you see, my dear children, read, and think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atin. You see, it takes a teacher to do that, huh? Now, I think the very fundamental thing that Datin has actually impressed upon us is to use the brain, and that's the idea of education, actually. And that leadership development, as we talk about it here, is, as she had put it, of two things: becoming a leader in your own right, becoming a leader within your own sphere, and making leaders, identifying and creating leaders of the future. And for that, you need to use your brain, right? A lot of gray matter. Okay, so the second book that you mentioned, Datin, is on history, and we wanted to have with us today a historian, Professor Kuke Kim, who was going to give, I was hoping that he was going to give us a little perspective on the history of leadership in the country, because you don't have the past, then you don't have the present, and certainly you don't have the future. So you need that too. But in his space, I think also, Dr. Ahmad Murad Marikan will be able to give you an insight into what has happened before and how it leads to the future. And I hope he will also talk a little bit about the futures study that he's doing right now. Dr. Ahmad Murad Marikan.
Thank you, Puan Zuraida. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I had no choice this afternoon while having lunch. I was not given a choice. I was told to be a panel member, and I also have not given an answer, but I'm here. I would highlight a number of issues which is in my mind regarding education and the intelligent population in Malaysia, how we can move forward and move backward to move forward. But first of all, I will start with this. I was thinking of my kids. I have two kids. My son, 15 years old, he's in Form 3, and my daughter, 12 years old. I married late. Perhaps I was busy educating myself. My daughter is a reader. She reads books. I gave her books, and I gave her books that I have read. Her name is Sophia, by the way, as after Philosophia. So I gave her books on philosophy, on history, and she read, and she will relate to me what she has read. She is very obedient. She will do what I will tell her to do. My son, on the other hand, 15-year-old kid, have told me he's not interested in my books. He told me that when he was 12. And he also told me that I cannot force him to read books. I cannot force him to be what I want him to be. Now this poses some questions to me. Education, is it coercion? Can we coerce? I was coerced to be here. But if you look at education from the lowest level until the highest level, it is early on, it's coercion. You are forced to do things that you would not think of. I mean, you are forced to go to school. We all of us are forced to go to school, Standard 1 and whatever. We are forced to go to secondary school. But at a certain level, there will be a choice. This is very American. See? The word choice is a very American word. Choice may not mean anything. But we are told that we are given a choice, so we have made a choice within a certain set of assumptions. Now, perhaps these are the two dimensions behind education, coercion and choice. But also we can ask, what is the purpose of education? Many people have asked this morning, we had the keynote and Tan Sri and Datin Frida. But to me, the purpose of education is consciousness. We can say many things about education, but ultimately it is the consciousness of who we are, what we are, why we are here. It's not only the consciousness of ourself, it is also the consciousness of the larger society, of being. Okay? I remember reading E.F. Schumacher, not the racing driver, but this the famous economist, German economist who wrote in English, "Small is Beautiful." I read that 20 years back. I mentioned that he used this idea of a toolbox. Education is giving tools for people to learn, giving a toolbox. But if we give a toolbox without any values, then the toolbox will not be able to be used in an optimum way. But if we give the wrong value, then the toolbox will be used wrongly. So again, it is the toolbox with values. Now, what are values? What are values are we talking about? What is this? No, when we talk about education, we're talking about education in the context of the nation. Okay? We are conscious that we are citizens of Malaysia. We are conscious that we are members of Malaysian society. We are conscious that we are members of this geography, okay? this place, this sense of place. Okay? Some people may have a greater sense of place than others, but we have to imbue this sense of place, the geography that makes up Malaysia, and this sense of time, which is the history that has fed into what we are now. So when we talk about the sense of place and the sense of time, the history and the geography that makes the person, I again would like to refer you to my experience in Sri Skandar. I mean, I come from a place about 3.5 hour drive from here. I relocated myself actually. I was in the Klang Valley for many years since I joined ITM after Tan Sri left. I was a student there. It was an experience being in ITM. I was there since 1978, so I've been in Klang Valley for a long time. I was also teaching in UITM. I left about 3 years back for many reasons. So I'm now recruiting myself in a place far away from the Klang Valley. Now I'm staying in a neighborhood. My neighbor this couple with 5 kids. We have 2 different worldviews. The husband and wife, they come from an Islamic Arabic education tradition. Yeah? They are schooled in Jordan. They graduate from Jordan University. They speak Arabic. They send their kids to a private Islamic school. Okay? Because there are 2 versions of, apart from the vernacular and the national school, there are 2 versions of Islamic schools in Malaysia. One is the traditionalist school, the other is the modernist Islamic school. Okay? So they send their kids to them. They are products of Islamic education in Penang and Kedah, sekolah menengah agama and so on. So they came from that tradition. They are confined, and their consciousness was within that Muslim education worldview. Okay? I wouldn't say Islamic worldview, okay? But from that worldview that has been inculcated in school. I come from a different tradition. Okay? I pride myself to be a student of Penang Free School, the first school east of Suez. At that time, they say the first English school east of Suez. Even India doesn't have an English school. The first English school east of Suez, 1816, okay? East of Suez. Now people forgot about Suez Canal. Actually, that's history. I come from Penang Free School, the colonial school. I remember my first day in Penang Free School. We have this halls, and we walk as if I'm in a colonial era. And my teachers, as if they appeared from some colonial textbook, whatever. I mean, they speak Queen's English, they cite Shakespeare, Coleridge, and Byron. So I remember what they say. And my primary school is Francis Light. Francis Light is after 1928. Francis Light was the so-called founder of Penang. Okay? So I come from that tradition. And after that, I moved to ITM, and I went to Minnesota. So, and Penang, and that is a very colonial place. The schools there were very colonial. I was exposed to the colonial education system, although I'm not that old. I was at the tail end of that colonial education system. Everything was in English. Shakespeare, English literature was one of the main subjects. History is colonial history. Okay? So those things were imposed upon me. I'm conscious of that. Those things create a consciousness. But I'm not saying that I conform to colonial values. In fact, it makes me anti-colonial. It makes me critical of colonialism. Okay? I sometimes regard myself a post-colonial scholar. Okay? Because I move away and extend my boundaries to post-colonial studies to some extent. So it makes me wanting to revise history. Right? Revise history in the sense that when I talk about the history of Malaya, I'm here not because I replaced Koo Kay Kim, or not because I'm saying this because of Koo Kay Kim. No, it's independent of him. But the history of Malaya is the history of the British in Malaya. The history of Malaysia is the history of the colonialists in Malaysia. So one of the things that we have consumed is a history that is not connected to us. And one of the things which I'm doing is to revise the history of Penang, which is to counter a Eurocentric perspective. Now this brings me to an issue which has manifested itself over the last 2 decades, which I've written and which worries me, actually. But then we have to be happy, or rather contented, because we live in imperfections. We have to live in imperfections, and we have to try and move forward because of that. There are many histories of Malaysia. When we walk into good bookshops, we'll find this over the last 2 decades. Bookshelves under the label Malaysiana, or Malaysia, and you find books trying to get our attention. Now, these books were not present before. They were not present in the 60s or 70s or 80s. But they were present, they were much in the market. They began to be in the market in the late 80s. Especially after the Cold War. After many things that has happened that has collapsed the old order. And in turn created the emergence of identity throughout the world. And this has affected Malaysia. Now, what you see in these books would be the non-Malays, okay? The non-Malay community claiming history, claiming that they are part of nation building, claiming that they were here before. So we find, and also this began more or less when there were a number of books written by and about the Malayan Communist Party, members of the Malayan Communist Party, and they were trying to get these narratives in the mainstream. So there was another narrative. Early on, there was this Malay-centric, UMNO-centric, so-called national-centric narrative of the nation, displayed in various books, in various literature. But over the last 2 decades, we find another narrative. Okay? Hence, you see this term like the other Malaysia. Farish, I don't know what he wants, but there's this other Malaysia, many Malaysias, and now one Malaysia. One Malaysia is a response to the other Malaysia and many Malaysias. Okay? So this is reflected in these books. Books about, say, Chinese involvement in nation building in Malaysia. One of the other books, and the Chinese dilemma. The Indians, over the last few years, we find a number of 4 or 5 books or more actually on the Indians and the Hindus in Malaysia, manifesting a version of history. And also you find, of course, narrations about nation coming from outside the country, both in the region and from other areas, from the Occidental knowledge and power producing centers, Australia, especially Australia, the Anglo-Saxon world, Western Europe and so on. So this gives, again, a multitude of consciousness. Where are we? Why are these identities emerging? Now, what implications would these identities have on educating Malaysians? Because when you talk about history, when you talk about the many histories, all of us consume history. See, history is not a subject that we learn and remember dates and events and ideas. We consume history and we produce history. Therefore, history is a practical discipline. But unfortunately, the education system in Malaysia has killed history. You can quote me on this. Both the schools and the universities. You know, many years back, history was taught in Standard 4. I was Standard 4. I remember my history book. Francis Wright was the founder of Penang, and the history book in that time, that was 1967, had this picture of the French storming the Bastille, the French Revolution, the famous slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the social contract, which has been in the national consciousness over the last 25 years. But all these discourses have not mentioned the perspective of where and when the context of the social contract. It's not just an arbitrary word. It has its historical roots. Okay? It's a mechanism in the modern state. It began with Aristotle and Plato, but then Rousseau has established this doctrine of social contract, which was not mentioned at all by anybody in Malaysia. In any book I've checked. I wrote a piece in the Sunday Times a few weeks ago about this. So again, it informs us on our consciousness. And in the universities, only 3 universities have history departments, but 1 have already diluted the history department and merged history department to politics and strategy. The only ones, 2 have left are University Malaya and University of Science Malaysia. So here, again, the education system in Malaysia has to grapple with the many histories. What kind of history? What history should we teach? Because if we want to use education for the purposes of nation building, and again here, nation building is not a sacred word. Okay? We have to understand that nations come and go. We have to look at history to know that. And nations, as in the modern nation state, is a new phenomenon. And the nation state is, with regard to almost all nation states in the world, are artificial creations. So again, when you talk about nation states do change, boundaries do change. That's why it's important to know space and place, that is geography. So again, when you talk about history, where the nation is concerned, it is a very complex issue, but the nation has to establish a monolithic narrative. I'm not going to say about single official history, but a monolithic narrative of what the nation is. At this point in time, there are many narratives. Okay? There are Malay nationalist narratives, Chinese narratives, Indian narratives, post-colonial narratives, colonialist narratives, palace narrative, and so on. But there must be a monolithic narrative that establishes and creates a context in the education process. And this is where I'm grappling with when I teach Malaysian Studies at University of Technology Petronas. I teach Malaysian Studies, which is a requirement for non-government universities. And I find that the syllabus is simplistic. The textbook are full of errors. It misleads. Okay? So what I do is I amend the syllabus. Okay? All lecturers have the authority to amend the syllabus. I mean, unless you change the whole world, you have to go to somewhere to get approval. But I mean, the syllabus is managed by the Malaysian Qualification Agency. But I amended the syllabus. I increased the component for history because I want to establish that we have to understand who we are. We have to understand where we are. We have to strengthen our identity, and we have to be tolerant. Okay? When I say this, I do not mean that if I say that there has to be a monolithic history, I don't mean that we deny other histories. When I say that I want to rebut the event that Franz Light landed in Penang, I'm not denying that Franz Light landed in Penang. Okay? I'm saying that there has to be there is another view of looking at the word founding, for example. There has to be another view of looking at the population in Penang before the British came. In fact, the British did not come to Penang, they came to Kedah. So the perspective is that there is no Penang, there is the perspective of Kedah. And those people in Penang at that time were not people from Penang, but they're people from Kedah. They are Kedahans living in Penang. So these are the things that we have to reconstruct. It's not denying other histories, but looking at other histories as complementary to the nation's history. And this is where the education ministry must come in. The education ministry must be populated with people who are not bureaucratized. Okay? There's so much bureaucracy in the education ministry that teachers just fear to call the principal or to make an appointment with the director. I think that we have to do away with that. There has to be less bureaucratization. There must be some bureaucracy, of course, but less bureaucratization of the education ministry, and there has to be this an inclusive approach in terms of developing a history curriculum for the schools. I'm not talking for universities, but for the schools. And within that, we have to address many problems. We have to address the teacher training problem, and we have to address the pedagogical problem of teaching history. Now, history as taught in, for example, a Chinese school will be different from teaching history being taught in a Malay school, or in other schools, or in an Arabic school, for that matter. So the pedagogy, the emphasis, and also who teaches history. Again, these are the things that has to be grappled with, because I evaluate university programs, and I will look also into the books and the pedagogy of the college or the university and how certain areas are taught. So on that note, I will conclude with the area of future studies. Now, future studies is not about the future. Future studies is about the present. Now, In Malaysia, because the moderator mentioned that I'm a proponent of future studies. Actually, I'm not really. I was exposed to future studies earlier, and I'm advocating future studies to be taught in my university, University of Technology Petronas, and also other universities in Malaysia. It's not a course in terms of planning. It is an assemblage of areas and teams. It started with RAND Corporation, and it developed with Hudson Institute and so on. And it's not a field or discipline, but it is an area that has to be taught to us in various forms. Now, it involves, for example, some of you may be exposed to scenario planning, for example. That's part of future planning, or future studies. It's future studies. And teaching future studies would develop this culture of long-term thinking. And this is where our leaders fall short. Long-term thinking. Okay? Why can't we think long-term in the long durée concept? One of the things, because we look down on the critical thought. Again, both in the universities and in schools, we are not taught to be critical. And being critical, and when we are critical, we assume to be subversive. This again has to change. If Malaysia doesn't change into being critical, in getting into the critical mode, we'll never think. Because being critical is not anti-government. This assumption has been around over the last 2 decades also. Being critical, people think that being critical, oh, well, you're critical, so therefore you must be on the other side. I said, no, I can be on every side.